The wind came down off the ironwood ridge, carrying the smell of frost and wood smoke. Inside the small mercantile, the tall woman stacked peach tins into a pyramid. Her hands needed something to do. The bell over the door hadn't rung yet, but the air had already shifted. A strange hush before the break. The door slammed open. A massive figure filled the frame. Broad shoulders, hat pulled low, a slight limp. He walked straight to the counter and planted both hands on the wood. "Miss Merritt," she set the tin down slowly. Her pulse quickened. "Mr. Calder, something I can get you, a wife. By tomorrow noon." The words hung between them like a stone. A jar of penny candy seemed to hold its breath. She blinked once. His storm gray eyes didn't leave hers. Beneath the desperation lay a father's broken promise, land under threat, and an old shadow waiting in the dark. She should have thrown him out. She didn't, because he stood there like a man at the edge of a cliff who still remembered to take off his hat. "You've got until I finish these peaches," she said. "Talk fast." He drew a breath, voice rough, and the story of his father and the will began. The wind came down off the ironwood ridge that morning, carrying the smell of frost and wood smoke. Josephine Merritt stood behind her counter, sleeves rolled to the elbow, stacking tins of peaches into a pyramid. Nobody in Ironwood, Wyoming Territory, had asked for. She did it anyway, because her hands needed something to do. Because idle hands remembered things she'd rather forget. The bell over the door hadn't rung yet. It would. She felt it before she heard it. A shift in the air. The particular hush that fell over a room right before something broke it open. Then the door slammed back on its hinges, and the whole frame of the doorway filled up with a man. Not filled up the way most men filled a doorway. Filled it the way weather fills a valley. Shoulders that had to turn sideways to get through. A hat pulled low, dust riding the brim like it had chased him the whole way down from the hills. And a limp, slight. The kind you'd miss if you weren't the kind of woman who'd spent her whole life being looked at and had learned, in turn, to look back twice as hard. She knew him. Everyone in Ironwood knew him. The way you know a mountain, from a distance, by reputation. Weston Calder, 33 years old, and living up in that ridge cabin, like the rest of the world, had personally wronged him, and he intended to hold the grudge till he died. He didn't say good morning. He didn't take off his hat. He walked straight to the counter and planted both hands on the wood like he needed it to hold him up. "Miss Merritt." Josie set down the peach tin. Slow. Careful. The way you set down anything when your pulse has just picked up, and you don't want your hands to show it, Mr. Calder. She kept her voice even. "Flat as creek ice. Something I can get you. A wife." The word just sat there, between them. Like he'd dropped a stone on the counter and expected her to pick it up. Josie blinked. "Once, I'm sorry? A wife," he said again, like repeating it made it less insane. "By tomorrow morning." Before noon, somewhere behind her, a jar of penny candy seemed to hold its breath along with her. "Mr. Calder, I run a store. Not a marriage bureau. I know what you run." His jaw worked. His eyes, gray. Storm gray. The kind of gray that had seen weather, and remembered every hour of it, didn't leave hers. "I know you don't know me. I know this sounds like the ravings of a man who spent too long alone in the mountains talking to his horse." That thought had crossed my mind. "Then let me finish before you throw me out." She should have thrown him out. She didn't, because there was something under the desperation, something that didn't match the wildness of the request. A kind of exhausted, bone-deep dignity. Like a man standing at the edge of a cliff who still remembered to take his hat off before he jumped. "You've got until I finish restocking these peaches," Josie said. "Talk fast." He talked. "My father is dead 3 weeks. Buried him myself, up on the ridge next to my mother. And in his will, there's a clause." His voice cracked on the word. Clause like it cost something to say it out loud. "Says I have to be married. Married. By my 33rd birthday. Or the ranch, 400 acres. The herd, the water rights. Everything my father built with his own 2 hands goes to a court-appointed guardian. Gets sold off. Split up. Gone." "When's your birthday?" Josie asked. Already knowing. Already dreading the answer before it came. "Tomorrow." There it was. The room tilted a little. Just a little. The way a room does when the ground under it stops being solid. You want me, Josie said slowly, to marry a stranger, tomorrow. Because your father wrote a clause into his will. Yes, why me? And here was the part that would stay with her. Long after this conversation. Long after everything that came next. Because Wes Calder didn't flinch. Didn't look away the way most men did when they looked at her too long, and realized how far up they had to tilt their chin. Because you're the only person in this town who's never once made me feel like a spectacle, he said. And I figured you might understand what that's worth. Better than most, the pyramid of peach tins wobbled. She hadn't touched it. Her hand had, without her permission, come up to grip the counter edge because he wasn't wrong. Because she knew exactly what it cost to be looked at and measured and found remarkable for all the wrong reasons. She'd built a whole life running from that exact feeling. You don't know anything about me, she said. Quiet now. I know you're kind to old Mrs. Delacroix when she can't pay for her flour. I know you built those shelves yourself because you didn't trust the carpenter's measurements. I know you've got hands like a blacksmith and a face like you're always waiting for the other boot to drop. He paused. I'm not asking you to love me, Miss Merritt. I'm asking you to help me keep a promise I made my father. That's all, she repeated, half a laugh in it. Half something else. I'll pay you, he said. Whatever you want. You could leave after a year. 2. Whenever you like. I'm not. He stopped. Started again. I'm not asking for a real marriage. Just the paper. Just enough to satisfy a judge and a dead man's lawyer. Josie looked at him, really looked at the dust on his coat, at the hands gripping the counter, knuckles pale, at the limp he was trying to stand through instead of favor, and she thought, not of him, not yet. She thought of May, of a canvas tent in Kansas, and a rope that snapped, and a scream that still, 4 years later, woke her up some nights with her own heart going like a hammer against her ribs. She thought of running, of how good she'd gotten at it, and she thought, someone offered you kindness once, and you were too afraid to take it. Look what that cost. What's your condition? She heard herself say. Wes's head came up. Something in his face. Hope? Maybe, though it looked like a stranger wearing his features. Like hope was a language his face had forgotten how to speak. My condition? You said you have conditions for the marriage. I have one for mine. Name it. You will never. She started, and had to stop. Had to steady the thing rising in her throat before it became something she couldn't control. You will never be ashamed of me. Not in front of your ranch hands. Not in front of the town. Not in a room. Not on a street. Not anywhere a person could look at me sideways. And you could choose to look away instead of standing your ground. Her voice had dropped low and it shook, just slightly, at the edges. I have spent my whole life being someone's spectacle, Mr. Calder. I will not be anybody's again. Not even for 400 acres and a dead man's promise. The store was silent. Outside, a wagon rattled past. A dog barked twice and quit. Wes Calder took off his hat, held it against his chest like a man in church. You have my word, he said, and I don't give that lightly. Neither do I. Then we understand each other. We understand nothing, Josie said, and something in her voice cracked open into something almost like a laugh, almost like grief, hard to tell the two apart anymore. We're two strangers agreeing to a lie in front of God and a minister. Let's not pretend that's understanding. Fair enough. Tomorrow morning, she said. Before noon. I'll close the store. I'll come for you at 8. He set his hat back on, turned toward the door. Stopped, Miss Merritt. Yes, thank you. He was gone before she could answer. The bell over the door rang once, sharp, and then the street outside swallowed the sound of his boots, and she was alone again with a pyramid of peaches and a promise she had no earthly business making. She sat down on the stool behind the counter, hard, like her legs had simply stopped being consulted on the matter. Married. By tomorrow. To a man she'd exchanged maybe 40 words with. In 8 months of watching him ride in twice a season, buy salt and coffee, and nothing else, and ride back out without so much as a nod to anyone on the street, because that's what she'd liked about him, if she was honest. He'd never once stared, which was more than she could say for half this town. She should say no. She should close up early, bar the door. Sit in the back room with a cup of chamomile and let this whole conversation dissolve into the kind of story she'd tell herself was a fever dream. Except, she thought of the letter in the bottom of her trunk. The one from May, 3 years old now, postmarked from a town she'd made herself forget the name of. The one she'd never answered, because answering it meant admitting what she'd done, what she hadn't done, the rope, the scream, the running. And she thought, you have spent 4 years building a life where nobody can hurt you because nobody gets close enough to try. And now a stranger has walked in and asked you to be brave for a single year. Could she even remember how, that night, Josie didn't sleep so much as she lay in the dark and argued with herself in the particular, circular way of a woman who already knows what she's going to do and is simply waiting for her nerve to catch up to her decision. She thought about her mother's voice, dead 9 years now. The one thing about her childhood in Ohio she still let herself remember on purpose. You take up space, Josephine. Don't apologize. For the room you need, she thought about the tent. About Colonel Vandergrift's voice through the canvas, announcing her like a prize heifer. Ladies and gentlemen, the tallest woman in the territory. She thought about May's hand slipping out of hers. By the time the sky over the ridge went the color of a healing bruise, gray shading into something almost gold, Josie had made her peace with it, not with the marriage, with the fear. She folded it up small, the way she'd learned to fold up everything that fold up threatened to be too big for the room, and she got dressed, and she waited. Wes Calder arrived at 8 o'clock exactly, not a minute before, not a minute after. He'd shaved, trimmed his hair, though it still touched his collar, dark and a little wild at the ends, wore a coat that looked like it had been packed away in a trunk for years, and only recently forgiven for whatever sin had put it there. You came, he said, like he'd half expected her not to. I said I would. People say things, I don't. Something in his face eased at that, just slightly. The set of his jaw, unclenching by a fraction of an inch. They walked to the little clapboard church at the end of Ironwood's single street. Reverend Amos Fry met them at the door in his shirt sleeves, still buttoning his collar, looking between the two of them with the careful, unbothered patience of a man who had married worse-matched couples for worse reasons, and had learned a long time ago not to ask. You're certain, the Reverend said, to both of them. Not unkindly, yes, Wes said. Josie looked at him, at the gray eyes, at the hands that had, she noticed now, a fine tremor to them that had nothing to do with the cold. Yes, she said. The ceremony took 9 minutes. Josie would remember later that she counted them, the way she counted everything. When she was afraid. Counted floorboards, counted heartbeats, counted the seconds between his voice breaking and hers holding steady. I will try to be a good husband to you, he said, so quiet only she heard it, when he slid a plain silver band onto a finger, too big for anything he could have bought in town. This had been his mother's. She could tell by the wear in the metal, the shape worn soft by another woman's years of living. Just don't be ashamed of me, Josie said back. That's all I need from you. Reverend Fry pronounced them married. His wife, standing witness in a shawl pulled tight against the cold, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief for reasons, Josie suspected, had less to do with sentiment and more to do with the fact that Mrs. Fry had never in her life witnessed a wedding move quite so fast, and that was that. Josephine Merritt walked out of the church as Josephine Calder. And the sky over Ironwood didn't so much as blink at the fact that the whole shape of her life had just changed in under a quarter of an hour. The ride up to the ranch took most of the afternoon. The trail climbed steady out of town, switching back through stands of lodgepole pine, the air going thinner and colder the higher they went. Josie sat beside Wes on the wagon bench, her hands folded in her lap, watching the town shrink behind them into something small enough to hold in her palm. You built the addition yourself, she said. Not a question. She'd heard it somewhere. One of the ranch hands, maybe, talking in the mercantile. That Calder had spent 3 weeks up at the cabin, hammering something together. Wouldn't say what, had to. Wes kept his eyes on the trail. House my father built was 1 room. Wasn't going to ask a wife to share a single room with a stranger, even a fake one, especially a fake one. He glanced at her quick, sideways. Didn't seem right otherwise. They didn't talk much after that. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. Exactly. It had a texture to it. Two people taking each other's measure without the noise of words getting in the way. When the cabin came into view, Josie's breath caught. It sat in a clearing ringed by pine, smoke already curling from the chimney. Jubal Creed. She'd learn later, the ranch manager, had lit the stove before riding out that morning. A small kindness that would matter more than he'd ever know. The original cabin was modest, weathered gray. The kind of honest, unshowy structure built by a man who cared more about function than appearance. But the addition was something else. The doorframe had been built high, higher than any doorframe she'd walked through since she fled from father's house in Ohio, the one place in the world that had ever been built to her scale, instead of asking her to shrink herself into someone else's. I didn't know you're. Wes started and stopped, and she watched him choose his words with the particular carefulness of a man who'd clearly thought about this more than he wanted to admit. I asked around. About what might make it easier. Didn't want you ducking under your own roof? Josie stood in the doorway a long moment, not moving, because she hadn't cried in front of a stranger in longer than she could remember. She wasn't about to start now. Except her throat had gone tight, and her eyes had gone hot, and she had to look away, hard, out at the tree line, until she trusted her voice again. You didn't have to do that, she said finally. I know. Most people don't think of it. Most people, Wes said, aren't married to you, she laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it, rusty and sudden, like a door that hadn't been opened in years swinging free on its hinge. We've been married 6 hours, long enough to know some things. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, and faintly, of the fresh-cut lumber of the new addition. A bed sat against the far wall, and Josie's breath caught again, differently this time, because it wasn't a bed built for an average woman and then apologized for. It had been built long, built wide, built like it expected her to take up exactly as much room as she needed. I measured wrong the first time. Wes said, behind her, and there was something almost shy in it, something that didn't match the mountain-sized man who'd stormed into her store demanding a wife by morning. Had to redo the frame twice. Who'd you measure against? Guessed. Then Jubal's wife set me straight. Told me to ask around town instead of standing outside your store with a measuring tape like a lunatic. Josie pressed her hand flat against the headboard, felt the plane of the wood, sanded smooth, no splinters, no shortcuts. Thank you, she said, and meant it in a way that surprised her. That night, they ate a quiet supper, beans and cornbread, Jubal's wife having left a pot warming on the stove. At a table built, Josie noted without comment, at a height that didn't force her to hunch. Wes talked, haltingly, about the ranch, about the herd. The father in careful sideways fragments. The way a man talks about a wound that hasn't finished healing. He didn't mention fiancé. Josie didn't ask, not yet. 3 days into the marriage, Josie found the letter. She hadn't been looking. That mattered to her later when she turned the whole afternoon over, in her mind, trying to decide whether she'd done something wrong. She'd only been reorganizing the small writing desk in the front room. Her own habit, straightening things, making order out of a space until it felt like it belonged to her. When a drawer stuck, and she'd had to pull harder than she meant to, and the drawer had come loose all at once and spilled its contents across the floor. Old letters, a pressed flower, brittle and colorless with age. And a folded document, official-looking, with a wax seal long since broken. She shouldn't have read it. She read it anyway. It was a letter of intent, a land offer. Dated 11 years back, addressed to Wes's father. Josie recognized the name. Nathaniel Calder. From the deed at the courthouse she'd glanced at before the wedding, back when she was still telling herself she needed to know exactly what she was signing. The offer was for the ranch. All 400 acres. Water rights included. The signature at the bottom read, Ambrose Kettering. Josie sat back on her heels, letter in hand, and felt something cold settle low in her stomach, because she knew that name. Everybody in Ironwood knew that name. Ambrose Kettering owned half the rail spurs cutting through the territory, had his hand in every mining claim from here to the Montana line, and had, according to town gossip that Josie had always dismissed as embellishment, never once in his life taken no for an answer and meant it. 11 years ago, Nathaniel Calder had said no to him. And now Nathaniel Calder was dead 3 weeks, and his will had a clause in it that had nearly cost his son the ranch outright. A clause that would have handed everything to a court-appointed guardian, sold off piece by piece the moment Wes failed to marry in time. Sold off to whom? Josie didn't need to guess. She folded the letter back along its old creases. Careful. The way you'd handle something that might still be dangerous, even after all these years. And she sat there on the floor of the front room, with her back against the desk, until she heard Wes's boots on the porch steps outside. She didn't say anything that night. She told herself she was still turning it over, still deciding what it meant, still not entirely sure the coincidence wasn't just that. A coincidence, an old rejected offer with no bearing on anything happening now. She told herself a lot of things. None of them let her sleep. It was 4 days later in town for supplies that the second piece fell into place, and it fell into place the way most terrible truths do. Sideways, overheard, not meant for her ears at all. She'd gone into the land office to pay the quarterly fee on the store lease. She'd kept the lease even after selling the business back to old Mr. Hargrove, some instinct telling her not to cut every tie to the life she'd built, before Will Calder walked into it, and she'd heard voices through the half-open door of the back office. Elias Whitcomb's voice, the lawyer who'd handled Nathaniel Calder's estate, and another voice. Lower, smoother, a voice that carried the particular confidence of a man who had never once had to raise it to be obeyed. The clause held, the second voice was saying, "That's all that matters." Held right up until the boy found himself a wife. "I didn't care for the arrangement, Mr. Kettering." Whitcomb's voice tight. "I want that on the record. I drafted it because Nathaniel was dying and you'd made it clear to him what would happen to his hands, his workers, his herd, if he didn't. I made it clear," Kettering said, "that a dying man owed it to the people, depending on him to think practically." Nathaniel Calder was a stubborn fool who turned down a fair offer 11 years ago out of pure spite, and it cost him nothing but pride, until the day he needed a doctor he couldn't pay for. I simply reminded him, at the end, what stubbornness costs. You forced a clause into a dying man's will, I persuaded him. There's a difference, Elias, and you'd do well to remember which side of that difference your fee comes from. A pause. Long enough that Josie, frozen just outside the door, heard her own heartbeat in her ears. "The boy found a wife," Kettering said, and there was something in his voice now. Not defeat, nothing so simple as that. Something colder. Something recalculating. Faster than I expected. No matter. There's more than one road to a piece of land, Elias. I've built empires waiting out worse men than Weston Calder. Josie didn't remember walking out of the land office. She remembered standing on the boardwalk outside, the cold air sharp in her lungs, her hands shaking around the strap of her bag, and thinking, with a clarity that frightened her, "He didn't marry me to save a ranch. He married me to survive an ambush 11 years in the making. And he doesn't even know it yet." She rode back up the mountain trail alone, the wagon creaking under her, the letter's weight burning a hole in her memory, even though she'd left the paper itself folded back in that drawer, undisturbed, as if putting it back where she found it could undo the fact that she now knew Wes was on the porch when she pulled in. Splitting, kindling sleeves rolled despite the cold. He looked up, and something in her face must have shone, because he set the axe down and came toward the wagon before she'd even brought it to a full stop. Josie. It was the first time he'd used her given name instead of Miss Merritt out of old habit or Mrs. Calder out of new formality. It landed somewhere in her chest she wasn't prepared for. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to sit down before I do." That bad. Worse, he sat on the porch step in the cold, hat in his hands the same way he'd held it that first morning in her store, and Josie stood in front of him and told him everything. The letter, the offer, the voices through the land office door. Ambrose Kettering's name, said out loud in her own kitchen, her own porch, for the first time, and watching it land on Wes Calder's face like a physical blow. He didn't speak for a long moment after she finished. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere down the slope, a horse nickered in the corral, restless, sensing something in the air that had nothing to do with weather. Kettering, Wes said finally. Just the name. Like tasting something rotten, you know him. Everybody in this territory knows him. Wes's jaw had gone tight, a muscle working there Josie hadn't seen before. Not even in that first desperate conversation in her store. My father hated him. Never told me why. Just hated him. Wouldn't say the name in the house. He offered to buy this land. 11 years ago. And my father refused. And now your father's dead. And there was a clause in his will that nearly handed this ranch to a stranger the moment you failed to marry in time. Josie's voice had dropped low, urgent. Wes, that's not a coincidence. That's a plan. And it worked right up until yesterday morning when you walked into my store. Stood, slow. Like a man whose bones had suddenly gotten heavier. He walked to the porch rail and gripped it, knuckles going white, staring out at the land. His land, his father's land. 400 acres of grass and timber, and water rights that a man in a land office had just admitted. In plain words, he intended to have one way or another. He didn't just want the land, Wes said quietly. He wanted to watch my father lose it. That's what this was. Not a business deal. A grudge, 11 years old, and he was patient enough to wait until the man who wronged him was too sick to fight back. Wes. And now he's lost that fight, Wes said, turning to face her. And there was something new in his gray eyes now. Not desperation, the way there had been in the store. Something harder. Something that had just discovered it had an enemy, and intended to remember the man's name for as long as it took. Because you said yes. Because I walked into your store like a madman and you said yes. And now the clause is satisfied, and Kettering's whole plan just came apart in front of him. He said there's more than one road to a piece of land. Wes went still. Say that again. Those were his exact words. To your lawyer. There's more than one road to a piece of land. I've built empires waiting out worse men than Weston Calder. The silence that followed had teeth in it. Then this isn't over, Wes said. No, Josie agreed. I don't think it is. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he had in the store that first morning. Except something had shifted in the 8 days since. The desperation was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like gratitude, and underneath the gratitude, something rawer still, something neither of them was ready to name yet. I owe you an apology, Wes said. For what? I told you this was a simple arrangement, paper only. Turns out I married you into the middle of a war. I didn't even know I was fighting. His voice roughened. If you want out, if you want to take the money and go somewhere Kettering can't touch you, I'll understand. I won't hold you to a bargain I didn't fully understand myself. Josie looked at him for a long moment, at the mountain-sized man standing on a porch he'd built partly with his own grief and partly with his own stubborn hope, offering her an exit from a fight that had only become hers by marriage, by 8 days, by a bed built long enough that she didn't have to fold herself smaller. To fit in it, she thought of May, of the rope, of every time in her life she'd run, because staying felt too dangerous. I don't run, she said. Not anymore. I'm done doing that. Something in Wes's face broke open. Not sadness, the opposite sadness. Relief so raw it looked, for just a moment, like pain. Then I suppose, he said, we'd better figure out what Ambrose Kettering thinks he's going to do next. I suppose we better had. Above them, the first stars were coming out over the ridge. Cold and clear and indifferent to the two people standing on that porch. Newly married, newly allied, staring down a fight neither of them had chosen, and both of them now intended to win. Because that was the truth of it. Josie thought, standing there in the mountain cold with a stranger who'd stopped. Somewhere in the last 8 days, being quite so much of a stranger. Some marriages start with love, and end in something smaller. Theirs had started with a lie. And she had the strangest, most unsettling feeling that it might end up being the truest thing she'd ever agreed to. The survey crew came up the Eastern Trail, 11 days after the wedding, 6 men and 2 wagons loaded with iron stakes and a transit level, and they didn't ask permission, didn't send word. just rolled onto Calder land like they already owned it, which, Josie would think later, standing in the yard with her hands balled into fists at her sides, was probably exactly the point. She saw them from the porch first. Wes was down at the corral, working a green colt on a lead line, and she called his name once, Sharp, and he came up at a run despite the leg that still caught on him some mornings. "Kettering's men," he said, flat, already walking toward them before she could answer. She followed. Because that was the thing about being married 11 days to a man like Weston Calder. You learned fast that standing back and watching wasn't in either of their natures. The lead surveyor was a thin man with spectacles, and a ledger he held like a shield. He didn't look up from it until Wes was 3 feet away. Mr. Calder, bored, practiced, like he'd delivered this exact tone to a dozen men on a dozen porches. "We've got authorization to survey the eastern boundary. Company business. Whose company? Kettering Rail and Land. This is my land." Boundary disputes happen. The surveyor flipped a page. Didn't blink. Mr. Kettering's attorney believes there's a discrepancy in the original filing. Old surveys from the 70s weren't always. There's no discrepancy. That's not for you to determine, Mr. Calder. And that was when Josie stepped up beside her husband. Just stepped up. Didn't say anything yet. That's just let the surveyor's eyes travel upward. Because they always did. That particular slow climb. The way people's faces changed when they realized how far they had to tilt their chin, and watched the ledger dip a half-inch in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, throat working. "This is my land too," Josie said, quiet, even. "I signed papers 11 days ago that make it so. You want to stake a boundary dispute, you can do it through the county recorder, not by driving iron into ground that isn't yours to measure. I have authorization. From a man who doesn't own this ground," Wes said. "Which makes your authorization worth exactly nothing up here." The surveyor looked between them, at the mountain of a man with a limp and a jaw set like granite, at the woman beside him who stood taller than any man in the yard and hadn't raised her voice once. He closed the ledger. "We'll be back," he said, "with proper paperwork." "Bring it," Wes said, "and bring it in daylight. Because if I find stakes in my ground again without warning, I won't be nearly so polite about pulling them out." The wagons turned around. Slow, deliberate. Like even the horses knew they were retreating and wanted to make it look like something else. Josie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That's twice now," she said. "Twice in 11 days he's tried something. Third time's coming," Wes said, watching the wagon shrink down the trail. "Kettering doesn't quit because he loses a hand. He quits when the whole table's cleared, and there's nothing left to bet." That's a comforting thought. Wasn't meant to be comforting. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he'd started doing more and more, in the last week and a half, like he was still cataloging all the ways she surprised him. Wasn't meant to be a lie either. That night, Josie lay awake a long time listening to the wind work at the eaves, because something about the surveyor's face when he'd closed that ledger had stayed with her. Not fear exactly, calculation. The look of a man recording data for someone else's use. She's tall enough to intimidate a survey crew. Worth noting, she fell asleep somewhere past midnight, still turning that thought over, and she didn't like where it kept landing. The fire came 4 nights later. Josie woke to the smell first. Smoke, sharp and wrong, cutting through the cold mountain air in a way that didn't belong to a banked hearth or a chimney doing its ordinary work. She was on her feet before her mind had fully caught up to her body, and Wes was already at the window, already swearing, already pulling on boots he hadn't bothered to lace. "Barn," he said, one word. All that was needed. They ran. The stable stood 200 yards from the house, and by the time they reached it, the whole eastern wall was a sheet of orange. Flames climbing the old dry timber like they'd been waiting years for the chance. Inside, the horses were screaming. That sound, Josie would carry it the rest of her life. She knew that even as she heard it, some part of her cataloging the horror even while the rest of her moved. That high, terrible, animal scream of creatures who understood exactly what fire meant and had no way to open the doors themselves. "The latch," Wes shouted, already at the main doors, hands working at a mechanism gone hot enough to blister skin. It's jammed. Move. Josie didn't ask twice. She put her shoulder into the door. The whole 240 pounds of her, every inch of height that had made her a spectacle her whole life. Every part of her body she'd spent years apologizing for in small rooms and low doorways. And she threw it at that stuck latch like it was the only thing standing between her and everything she'd ever wanted to save. The wood splintered, the door gave, and the horses came pouring out into the yard, wild-eyed, half-mad with smoke, and Josie was already moving into the stalls that hadn't cleared, hauling at halters with hands that didn't feel the heat until much later, until the adrenaline had burned itself out and left her palms, raw and blistered, in the cold morning light. Jubal Creed arrived at a dead run from the bunkhouse, shirt half-buttoned, and threw himself into the bucket line with the other hands, and for 20 minutes there was nothing in the world but smoke and water and the terrible orange light, and Wes's voice, hoarse, counting horses out loud like a man afraid to stop counting, because stopping meant admitting one might not come. They lost the barn. They didn't lose a single animal. Josie sat afterward on an overturned water trough, coughing smoke out of lungs that felt scraped raw, watching the last embers die down into a black ruin that had been standing, whole and solid, 12 hours before. Wes crouched in front of her, checking her hands. His own face streaked black with soot, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "You could have been killed," he said finally. "Rough." "So could you. That's not the same thing, isn't it?" He looked at her hands again, at the blisters rising angry and raw across her palms. And something moved behind his eyes that Josie recognized, because she'd felt it too. Watching him run into that smoke, without a second's hesitation. Something that had nothing to do with a bargain, made over a will's deadline clause. And everything to do with a fear she wasn't ready to name yet. That door didn't jam on its own, he said instead, quiet. Cold in a different way than the fire had been hot. Latches don't seize like that. Not overnight. You think someone set it. I think someone made sure it'd be hard to open in a hurry. And I think that's not an accident that happens to line up the same week. Kettering's survey crew got run off my land. Behind them, in the gray light before dawn, Jubal Creed stood at the edge of the ruined barn, staring into the wreckage with an expression Josie couldn't quite read. She'd remember that expression later. She'd wish later that she'd read it right the first time. It took 2 more days to find the proof. Wes found it, in the end, not because he was looking in the right place, but because grief has a way of making a man methodical, and he'd spent those 2 days going through every inch of what remained of the barn, with a kind of grim, silent thoroughness that Josie recognized as its own form of mourning. On the 3rd morning he came into the kitchen, holding something small between 2 fingers, and his face had gone the color of old ash. "Found this in the wreckage," he said. "Near the latch. It was a coin. Not local currency, a company script token, the kind used to pay wages at a Kettering-owned operation, stamped with a K and a number Josie didn't recognize. Could have blown in from anywhere," she said. Though she didn't believe it even as she said it. Could have. Wes turned it over in his fingers. I know exactly one man on this ranch who's been drawing extra pay somewhere. He won't say where it's from." Josie's stomach dropped. "Jubal?" "I didn't want to believe it either." Wes's jaw worked. "Man's worked this land since before I could walk. Knew my father 30 years. Which is exactly why it took me 2 days to let myself look at it straight. They found him at the corral, mending a fence rail like the whole world hadn't just tilted sideways underneath him. He looked up when they approached, and something in his face, that same, something Josie had half-read in the smoke 2 nights before, went still and careful in a way that told her, before Wes even said a word, that they'd found the truth of it. "Jubal." Wes's voice was steady, steadier than Josie had expected. "I need you to tell me about the money." Jubal Creed set down his hammer. He didn't ask what money, that more than anything, told the story before he opened his mouth. "It wasn't what you think," he said. "Rough. Old. 30 years of loyalty cracking open in real time in front of them. I never touched that latch, Wes. I swear that on your father's grave. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, and I sure as hell never meant for you to lose that barn. Then what did you mean? Kettering's bank holds the note on my own 40 acres. Has for 6 years since the drought took my herd down to nothing. Jubal's hands shook. He was an old man, Josie realized then, really looked at. Old in a way that had nothing to do with years, and everything to do with weight carried too long alone. Man's agent came to me 2 months back. Said the note was overdue for renewal. Said it'd renew itself real easy if I just kept him informed. Told him what was happening up here. Nothing more than that, he said. Just information, where the herd grazed. When you rode to town. What days the hands were short-handed, Jubal wouldn't meet Wes's eyes now. I told myself it was nothing. Told myself I wasn't handing him anything. He couldn't have found out some other way. I didn't know about any latch, Wes. I swear it. I didn't know a fire was coming. If I had. But you knew something was coming. Silence, didn't you? I knew he was getting impatient, Jubal said barely above a whisper. 2 weeks back. Said his patience for a peaceful solution was running short. I should have come to you then. Should have told you everything and let the chips fall. Instead, I told myself it wasn't my business what a rich man's patience looked like. Wes stood very still for a long moment. The morning wind moved through the pines behind him, and somewhere in the corral a horse shifted its weight, restless, and none of it seemed to touch him at all. Get off my land, he said finally, quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been, Wes. You could have told me, any day in 6 years, you could have told me your note was in trouble, and I'd have found a way to help you. Instead, you sold information to a man who burned my barn down around 8 horses that could have died screaming, and you're standing here asking me to understand. I am asking you to understand, Jubal said, and there were tears on the old man's face now, unashamed, cutting tracks, through the soot, still clinging to his skin, from 2 nights of fighting that same fire alongside them. 'Cause I was there, in that bucket line too, Wes. I fought that fire, same as you. Same as your wife, I didn't know it was coming. And when it came, I fought it with everything I had, because whatever else I did, I never stopped loving this land or the family that built it. Josie watched Wes's face. Watched 30 years of trust war against 2 nights of fire, and a company script token found in the ash. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, Jubal said. I'm asking you to let me make it right. However long that takes, get off my land, Wes said again. But his voice had cracked, just slightly, at the edges. Not forever. Just go home tonight, let me think. Don't come back till I send word, Jubal nodded, once. Picked up his hat from the fence post and walked toward the bunkhouse, with the particular slowness of a man carrying something heavier than his own 2 feet. Josie put her hand on Wes's arm once he was gone. You didn't have to send him away for good, she said. I know, you're not the kind of man who throws away 30 years over one mistake. No, Wes said, and his voice was rough now, thick with something that wasn't quite anger anymore. But I am the kind of man who needs one night to grieve what I thought I knew about people before I figure out how to be decent about the rest of it. Josie didn't say anything else. She just stood beside him in the cold morning light, close enough that her shoulder brushed his, and let the silence do the work that words couldn't. Colonel Otis Vandergrift arrived in Ironwood on a Thursday, and Josie knew it was Thursday because she would remember, for the rest of her life, every detail of the day her past finally caught up to the life she'd tried so hard to outrun. She was in town for supplies, flour, coffee, a bolt of wool for the winter that was already breathing frost into the mornings. When she saw the poster nailed to the board outside the land office, bright red lettering, a crude woodcut illustration that bore only a passing resemblance to an actual human being, all exaggerated height and looming shoulders, standing over a crowd of tiny awestruck onlookers, Vandergrift's traveling wonders, one night only. See the marvels of nature herself. Her stomach turned to ice before she even finished reading it, because she knew that poster style, knew the particular curl of the lettering, the particular lurid red. She'd stood behind a canvas flap for 2 years of her life, while a man's voice announced her like livestock through exactly that kind of poster, exactly that kind of crowd. She was still standing frozen in front of the board when the voice came from behind her, smooth, theatrical, unmistakable, even after 4 years. Well, I'll be. Josie turned. Colonel Otis Vandergrift hadn't changed. That was the strange, sickening thing about it. Same waxed mustache, same gold watch chain stretched tight across a belly that had only grown rounder with prosperity. Same eyes that looked at a person and calculated, instantly, automatically, what that person was worth to him. Josephine Larkin, he said, drawing the name out like he was savoring it. Or is it something different now? I hear you've gone and gotten yourself married, Larkin. Nobody in Ironwood had ever heard that name. Josie had buried it the same week. She'd stepped off the train, 4 years back, and picked Merritt off a shopfront sign, liking the plain, forgettable sound of it. What are you doing here, Otis? Business, my dear. Same as always. He glanced at the poster, almost fond. Territories growing. New towns every season. A man's got to expand his attractions to keep up. I'm not one of your attractions anymore. No. Something shifted in his face. The showman's warmth dropping away all at once, replaced by something colder, more transactional. You're a woman who broke a contract, walked out onto debt, and left me holding a hole in my show that took me the better part of a year to fill properly. I didn't break anything that wasn't already broken. You signed papers, Josephine. I watched May get hurt, because you had her doing a stunt. No sane manager would have approved, Josie said, and her voice had dropped low and dangerous now, low enough that a passing farmer glanced over before hurrying on. I watched you stand outside that tent and keep announcing the next act while she was bleeding into the sawdust because, God forbid, the show stop for a girl's broken back. The show is how I feed 40 people, Josephine. The show is a business, same as any other. Then run your business somewhere else. I intend to. Vandergrift's smile came back, thin and sharp now. But before I do, I thought you'd want to know I've had some interesting conversations lately. About your new husband. About the trouble he's been having with a certain railroad man. Josie went very still. I don't know what you're talking about, don't you? Vandergrift's eyes glittered. Funny thing, running a traveling show. You meet all kinds of men in all kinds of towns. Rich men. Men who like to know things about their competition before they make their next move. Man like that approached me 2 weeks back. Said he'd heard a rumor about a certain giantess who'd married into some land trouble up in the territory. Asked if I might know anything useful about her history, her reputation, Kettering. I never said a name. You didn't have to. Vandergrift spread his hands, all false innocence. All I'm saying, my dear, is that a man like that pays very well for information. And a man like that would pay especially well to know that Weston Calder's brand new wife spent 2 years performing in a traveling show, running out on a signed contract, leaving a badly injured girl behind to do it. His voice dropped, silky and cruel. How do you think that story plays in a little mountain town like this one? How do you think your husband's neighbors look at him? Once they know his wife's whole marriage started with one lie built on top of another. Josie's hands had curled into fists at her sides. She was aware distantly of her own height in that moment. Aware of how she must look, looming over this small, cruel, calculating man in the middle of a public street. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel ashamed of it. She felt like using it. You listen to me, she said. Quiet, which made it worse somehow than shouting would have. You can put up every poster in this territory. You can tell every rich man who'll pay you for gossip whatever story makes you the most money. But you will not use May's pain as a bargaining chip in whatever game you're playing with Ambrose Kettering. She got hurt because of your greed, not mine. And if I ever hear you've used her name to threaten me again, I will make sure every town between here and the Missouri line knows exactly what kind of showman leaves a bleeding girl in the sawdust to keep selling tickets. Vandergrift's smile flickered. Just slightly. That's quite a speech, he said. For a woman who ran. I ran because I was a coward, Josie said. I'm done being one. She walked away before he could answer. Her hands didn't stop shaking until she was halfway up the mountain trail, the wagon creaking under a load of flour and coffee and a bolt of wool she barely remembered paying for. And even then the shaking didn't fully stop. It just moved somewhere deeper. Somewhere she couldn't reach it with breath or willpower alone, because Kettering knew, or he would, soon enough, if he didn't already. That night, the fire in the hearth burned low and orange, and outside the wind had picked up enough to rattle the shutters, and Josie sat in the chair Wes had built for her. Wide enough, deep enough. Built the way everything in this house had been built since the day she moved in, to hold exactly as much of her as she needed to take up. And she didn't say anything for a long time. Wes noticed. Of course he noticed. "You've been somewhere else since you got back from town," he said. "Not a question. I saw someone today. Kettering's men again." "No." Josie's hands twisted in her lap. "Someone from before." And because the fire was low, and the wind was loud enough to make the cabin feel like the only warm, solid thing left in the whole dark territory. And because she was tired in a way that went bone deep, tired of carrying a secret alone that had already started leaking out into the open, whether she wanted it to or not. She told him, all of it. She told him about the tent in Kansas, the crowds who paid a dime to gawk at a woman who stood 1.5 feet taller than any man who came to look at her. She told him about Colonel Vandergrift's voice through the canvas, announcing her like a prize heifer at auction. She told him about May, small, quick, funny May, the only person in that whole traveling show who'd ever treated her like a person instead of an exhibit. And about the night. Vandergrift pushed them into a stunt neither of them had trained properly for, because a rival show had rolled into the same town, and he needed something bigger, something more dangerous, to keep the crowds coming. "The rope broke," Josie said. Her voice had gone very quiet, very flat, the particular flatness of a story told so many times inside your own head that the words had worn smooth, like river's stones. She fell maybe 15 feet, landed wrong. I heard her spine, I heard the sound it made, and I've never, her breath caught. I ran to her. I did that much. I held her while she screamed, and I didn't let go until the doctor came. But when the doctor said she'd live, said she'd never walk the same again, but she'd live. You left, I left. The word came out like a confession because it was one, that same night. I packed what I could carry, and I walked out of that camp before the sun came up, because I couldn't stand to look at her one more day and know it was partly my fault. I'd argued for that stunt too, told Vandergrift we could handle it. I wanted the bigger act, wanted the bigger crowd, the bigger applause, because some sick part of me had started to enjoy being looked at instead of hating it, and that want cost May the use of her legs. Was quiet a long moment. The fire popped and settled. "You've been carrying that 4 years," he said. "Not a question either. Longer some nights, Josie." He turned in his chair to face her fully. "You didn't break her back. A rope did. A greedy man who wouldn't spend money on proper rigging did. You held her when it happened, and you've spent every day since paying a debt that was never fully yours to pay. I ran, Wes. Whatever else is true, I ran. So'd did I." The words landed quiet, heavy. Josie looked up. "I never told you about Adeline," Wes said. And his voice had gone rough now, the way it had that first morning in her store. The voice of a man reaching down into a part of himself he'd kept locked away for years. "We were to be married. 6 years back, before the accident that did this, he touched his leg, briefly. Before I got trapped under half a ton of collapsed timber, for the better part of 2 days during a cattle drive gone wrong. When they finally dug me out, I was broken, in ways that took the better part of a year to heal. Couldn't walk without help for months. Couldn't do half the things a rancher needs 2 good legs to do. What happened? I wrote her a letter from my sickbed. Told her I couldn't ask her to marry half a man. Told her to find somebody whole. His jaw worked," she wrote back. Dozens of letters, over months. I never opened a single one. Sent them all back unread, because I'd already decided what she must think of me, and I didn't have the courage to find out if I was wrong. Wes, she married someone else 2 years later. Died of a fever last winter, still married to him, still, as far as I know. Never having said a word against me to anyone. His eyes had gone bright, wet in the low firelight. I don't know what was in those letters, Josie. I'll never know now. Maybe she was heartbroken. Maybe she was angry. Maybe she was writing to tell me she didn't care about a bad leg, and I threw away 6 years of happiness because I was too proud and too afraid to read one single page. You ran too, Josie said softly, just without moving your feet. Yeah, a broken half-law. Suppose that's exactly what I did. They sat there a long while, the two of them, in the low orange light, each carrying a version of the same wound. We're a fine pair, Josie said eventually. Two people who ran from the exact same kind of fear, married by accident to fix a land dispute. Maybe it wasn't an accident. Wes, I'm not saying it was fate or providence or any of that nonsense. He reached over, slow, and took her hand, the blistered one, still healing from the fire, and he held it like it was something precious instead of something scarred. I'm saying I've spent 6 years being afraid to let anyone close enough to hurt me again. And in 3 weeks, I have let you closer than I let anyone in 6 years, and I am terrified. But I'm not running. Not this time. Josie's throat had gone tight. I'm not running either, she said. Not from Vandergrift. Not from Kettering. Not from this. Good, Wes said. Quiet. Certain. Because I don't think I could stand to lose someone else to my own cowardice twice in one lifetime. Outside, the wind kept working at the shutters, and inside, the fire burned down slow toward embers, and for the first time since the wedding, Josie let herself believe, just slightly, just for that one quiet hour, that whatever else this marriage had started as, it had stopped being a lie somewhere along the way. The reprieve didn't last. It was Elias Whitcomb who set the next piece in motion, though neither Josie nor Wes knew it until it was already too late to stop. The lawyer had been uneasy for weeks. Josie had seen it herself. That day outside the land office, in the tight, unhappy set of his shoulders, as Kettering's voice rolled, smooth and merciless, through the half-open door. A man who drafted a dying father's coerced will and had to live with what that meant. A man whose conscience, it turned out, had finally reached its limit. He sent word up the mountain on a Tuesday. A single folded note, carried by a boy on a borrowed horse, addressed to Wes in careful, cramped handwriting. Come to my office Thursday, before 9. Alone if you can manage it, though I understand if you cannot. I have found something in your father's papers I should have shown you weeks ago. I am sorry it has taken me this long to find my courage. E.W.E.'s read it twice at the kitchen table, his face unreadable, and then handed it across to Josie without a word. You're not going alone? She said, before he could even suggest it. He said alone if I can manage it. You can't manage it. I'm coming. Something almost like a smile crossed his face, brief and tired. Didn't figure I'd win that argument. You didn't. They rode down together Thursday morning, the frost thick on the grass, their breath clouding in the cold air, and Josie spent the whole descent turning over what could possibly be in Nathaniel Calder's papers that a dying man's own lawyer had waited weeks to reveal. She didn't get to find out that day, because when they reached Whitcomb's small office above the Mercantile, the door stood open. Not invitingly, but wrong, hanging loose on its hinge in a way no careful man would ever leave it. Papers lay scattered across the floor inside, a chair overturned, an inkwell shattered against the baseboard, its black stain spreading slow and permanent to the wood grain, and no Elias Whitcomb anywhere to be found, went very still in the doorway. Josie, I see it. He's gone. She stepped past him into the ransacked office, careful where she placed her boots among the scattered papers, and crouched to look closer at the overturned chair, at the pattern of the mess. Because it wasn't the mess of a robbery, she realized slowly, her stomach going cold. Nothing valuable was missing. The strongbox in the corner sat untouched, lock still fastened. Only the papers had been disturbed. Only the desk, only the drawers. Only whatever Whitcomb had been keeping close enough to reach for. On the morning he'd finally found his courage, they took what he found, she said quietly. Whatever he was going to show you, and they took him. The words hung in the wrecked little office like smoke that hadn't finished clearing. Wees stood in the doorway a long moment, his jaw working, his hands curling slowly into fists at his sides ever. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something low and certain that Josie hadn't heard from him before. Not the desperation of the man who'd walked into her store demanding a wife by morning. Not the grief of the man mourning a father, a barn, a trusted friend's betrayal. Something harder than any of that. Kettering's gone too far this time, he said. Wes, he burned my barn. He tried to buy my land out from under a dying man's grave. He sent a man to threaten you with your own past, and now he's taken the one person who might have proof of everything he's done." Wes turned to face her, and his gray eyes, in the cold light through the broken doorway, had gone dark and sure. "I don't know what Whitcomb found. I don't know where they've taken him, or if he's even still." His voice caught, just slightly, and he forced it steady again. "But I know this fight isn't about a will clause anymore. It stopped being about that the day he tried to burn my horses alive to make a point." Josie stepped closer, put her hand, still faintly scarred from that same fire, against his chest over the place where his heart was beating hard and fast beneath his coat. "Then we find him," she said, "together. Same as everything else since the day you walked into my store." "Together," Wes agreed. And something passed between them in that ruined little office, something that had started as a desperate bargain over a peach tin counter and had become, somewhere in the weeks since, a partnership neither of them had planned for. And neither of them, now, could imagine living without. They tracked the wagon ruts 2 miles east before they lost them in rock, because that's what kidnappers do. They stick to trails until the trails run out, and then they vanish into country that doesn't keep secrets so much as it swallows them whole. Wiz crouched at the tree line, reading sign like a man reading scripture. Broken branch. Boot print deep on the left side. A drag mark in the frost that could have been a heel. Could have been nothing. 2 men, he said. Maybe 3. Whitcomb's alive? Drag marks mean feet still moving. Dead men don't leave heel prints, he stood, winced. That leg again, the old wound picking the worst possible moment to remember itself. Kettering's mine camp sits 4 miles past this ridge. Man's got a whole operation up there. Nobody in town ever asks questions about. Then that's where we're going, Josie. Don't. He looked at her. Really looked. The way he'd started looking at her these past weeks. Like a man cataloging every reason not to lose the thing standing in front of him. "I wasn't going to tell you to stay behind," he said. "I was going to say, bring the rifle from under the wagon seat." Something in her chest loosened. Just slightly. Already did. The mine camp sat in a hollow, ringed by slag heaps and the skeletal shapes of ore carts gone still for the night. One building showed light. A long bunkhouse, fogged with lamp smoke, and outside it, 2 men leaning against the wall with rifles they weren't holding like they expected trouble. Which was their first mistake. Josie came around the back side, while Wes circled front, because that had been the plan, hissed out fast between 2 boulders. "You're taller than both of them combined. Use it. Don't let them see you until they have to look up." And for once in her whole life, being looked at was exactly what she wanted. She stepped out of the dark. The nearer guard turned, froze. His mouth actually fell open, rifle forgotten at his side, because nothing in his short, violent life had prepared him for a woman built like a doorframe, stepping out of the black pine shadow with her jaw set and her eyes flat and murderous. "Evening," Josie said. He ran, didn't even try to raise the gun. Just turned and bolted into the dark, like the devil himself had asked him to dance. And the second guard, hearing the commotion, came around the corner, straight into Wes's fist. 1 punch. The man went down like a dropped sack of feed. "That's for my barn," Wes said to the unconscious body. Then, glancing up at Josie, "You didn't even touch him. Didn't have to." They found Whitcomb in a storage shed behind the bunkhouse, wristbound. A gag half loosened where he'd worked it with his own teeth, blinking up at them in the lantern light like a man who'd stopped believing rescue was a real thing that happened to real people. "Calder," he croaked. "And good God." "Mrs. Calder, can you walk?" Wes said. "Already cutting the ropes. I can walk. I can talk. And I have a very great deal to tell you. If you'll get me out of this godforsaken shed before Kettering's men come back, from whatever supper they're currently ruining their appetites over." They rode through the night. Whitcomb wedged between them on the wagon bench, wrapped in Josie's coat, talking the whole way in fits and starts, like a man trying to unload 11 years of guilt before his courage failed him again. "There's a codicil," he said. "Not the will you already know. Your father's original will, plain simple, no strange clauses in it at all, was filed with the territorial court 8 years back, long before Kettering ever set foot in his sick room. What I never told you What I was going to show you the morning they took me is what your father did the same night Kettering forced that marriage clause on him. The same night. He called me back to his bedside, Whitcomb said. Alone. Past midnight, no one else in the house awake to see it. Signed something in secret. A countermeasure, in case the clause was ever used the way he suspected it would be. He didn't know if he'd live long enough to see whether it was ever needed. He signed it anyway. What does it say? I'll show the court everything. Tomorrow, all of it. Together, Whitcomb said. You've waited weeks already. Wes, one more morning won't break you. Wes had gone very still on the wagon bench, reins slack in his hands, staring straight ahead into the dark trail unwinding before them. He never told me, he said quietly. Not one word. He was trying to protect you, Whitcomb said. From knowing just how far a man like Kettering was willing to go while your father was too weak to fight him properly. And I think, the lawyer hesitated, I think he was testing you too, Wes. Wanted to see what kind of man you'd become, left to make the hardest choice of your life without a safety net dangled in front of you. Whether you'd marry out of duty, or fear, or something truer than either. Josie felt Wes's hand find hers in the dark, blind and certain, and hold on. Well, Wes said, voice rough. Guess he got his answer. They reached Ironwood as the sky was going gray at the edges, and there was no question, none at all, about what came next. The territorial circuit judge was in town for the fall session. Pure luck, the kind of luck that felt, in that gray dawn, almost like something Nathaniel Calder himself might have arranged from wherever he was now. And Whitcomb, still wrapped in Josie's coat, still trembling faintly from a night bound in a cold shed, insisted on walking straight to the courthouse before he'd let anyone so much as offer him breakfast. There isn't time to wait, he said. Kettering knows I'm loose now, knows what I know. A man like that doesn't sit still once his hand's been shown. He was right. By 9 o'clock, word had reached Ambrose Kettering that his lawyer's office had been found in shambles. His hired men scattered from a mine camp raid, and Elias Whitcomb himself sitting very much alive in the territorial courthouse. By 10, Kettering himself striding through the courthouse doors, immaculate in a gray coat despite the hour, his face composed into something that might have passed, to a stranger, for mild concern. By then the benches had filled. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Ironwood, and half the county seemed to have found a reason to be in that courthouse that morning. Shopkeepers, ranch hands, the Reverend and his wife, Sheriff Bannister, leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed. Josie was aware of every one of them. She did not shrink from a single face, Judge Harmon. Kettering's voice, smooth as river stone. I understand there's some confusion this morning about the Calder estate. I'm happy to clarify whatever's needed, Mr. Kettering. Judge Harmon, a gray-whiskered man with tired eyes that had clearly seen every flavor of territorial scheming there was to see, gestured toward the front bench. Have a seat. Mr. Whitcomb was just about to clarify a great self. Kettering sat, smiled, folded his hands. He did not know yet what was coming. Whitcomb stood. His hands still shook, faintly, but his voice, when it came, was steady as bedrock. Your Honor, I drafted the amended will of Nathaniel Calder 11 weeks ago. At his sickbed, under circumstances I am ashamed to say, I did not challenge as forcefully as my conscience demanded. A ripple moved through the crowded room. The clause requiring Weston Calder to marry, before his 33rd birthday, was inserted at the direct and repeated insistence of Ambrose Kettering, who made clear to a dying man that his ranch hands, his workers, and his son's inheritance would suffer for his stubbornness if he did not comply. That is a serious accusation, Mr. Whitcomb, Judge Harmon said. Do you have proof? I have the original correspondence. Whitcomb produced a small bundle of letters, bound with string. Letters from Mr. Kettering to myself, discussing terms of pressure to be applied to Nathaniel Calder during his final illness. I kept them. I told myself it was for my own protection. I understand. Now it was my conscience. Keeping evidence it knew I would eventually need the courage to use. Kettering's composed face had begun, very slightly, to crack. This is outrageous, he said. A man coerced into abandoning his post, fabricates letters to save his own reputation. I did not fabricate anything. Whitcomb's voice rose, sharp and certain. And there is more, Your Honor. Last night I was taken from my office by force, my papers ransacked, and held against my will at a mine camp, registered to Kettering Rail and Land. I was rescued by Mr. and Mrs. Calder before I could be silenced permanently. I have no doubt, once my usefulness to Mr. Kettering's men had run its course, the courtroom had gone utterly silent. That is a lie, Kettering said, but his voice had lost its smoothness now, had gone thin, brittle. 2 of your men are currently sitting in the town jail, West said, standing now himself, his voice carrying easy and hard across the room. One of them was more than willing to talk once, Sheriff Bannister explained, what kidnapping a territorial lawyer generally costs a man in this territory. I imagine he'll be even more willing to talk under oath. Kettering's eyes moved from Wes to Josie. Lingered there. Your wife, he said low, aimed at Wes but meant clearly, for the whole room to hear. Perhaps the court should also know precisely what kind of woman Mr. Calder married in such haste. A traveling performer. A woman who broke a signed contract and abandoned an injured colleague to do it. Hardly the character reference one would want, standing beside accusations of this magnitude. The room's attention swung toward Josie, like a physical weight. She did not shrink. She stood. My name is Josephine Calder, she said, and her voice filled that courtroom, the way her whole body had always filled every room she'd ever walked into. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let it. Before that, I was Josephine Larkin. Most of you in this room have only ever known me as Josephine Merritt, a name I chose for myself the day I stepped off a train in this town. Because I wanted one more chance to be looked at as a person instead of a performance. A murmur moved through the benches. Josie didn't stop, under either name. Yes, I performed for 2 years in Colonel Otis Vandergrift's traveling show because a woman my size finds precious few doors open to her in this world, and that one, however ugly, was open. I left that show the night my closest friend was badly injured performing a stunt Colonel Vandergrift never should have approved because he cared more for ticket sales than for her safety. I have spent 4 years believing that leaving made me a coward. I have that courage now in this room, and I intend to use it. She turned, looked directly at Kettering. You sent a man to threaten me with that shame. Mr. Kettering, hoping it would frighten me into silence, or frighten my husband into abandoning me, or simply cost us both enough humiliation that we'd hand you this land just to make the whispering stop. It did not work. Whatever you think you know about my past does not change one single fact standing in front of this court today, which is that you coerced a dying man, burned an innocent family's barn, bribed a desperate neighbor for information, and kidnapped a lawyer to keep him from telling the truth. That is the character this court should be measuring. Not mine. The silence that followed had real weight to it. Whitcomb raised a hand before the judge could speak. One more thing, Your Honor. The court should see this before anyone leaves. He unfolded a second document creased, worn soft from weeks carried close against his ribs, and read it aloud, right there with the room still full and every face in it turned toward him. A codicil, signed by Nathaniel Calder the same night he was coerced into the marriage clause. It provides that if the marriage requirement is ever contested, defeated, or used as grounds for a guardian sale, by any party, for any reason, the land does not go to a court-appointed guardian at all. It reverts automatically to the town of Ironwood itself, held in trust, never to be sold to any private buyer, at any price, for any purpose. Whitcomb looked up. Nathaniel Calder knew exactly what Ambrose Kettering wanted the moment he was forced to sign that clause. He simply made certain, that same night, that there was no version of this scheme that could ever end with this land in Mr. Kettering's hands. A murmur ran through the crowd, low and astonished. Kettering's face had gone the color of old paper. This isn't finished, he said. Quiet, to Wes, to Josie, to the whole room, though his eyes stayed fixed on the 2 of them standing together at the front of the courthouse. Yes, Wes said, it is. Judge Harmon cleared his throat. Mr. Kettering, I have heard enough this morning to order a full territorial investigation into your business dealings, effective immediately. Until that investigation concludes, Any claim you or your company holds against the Calder estate is suspended. Permanently, given what this court has just heard, Kettering stood, straightened his gray coat with hands that were, Josie noted with some grim satisfaction, no longer entirely steady. He walked out through the crowded courtroom, past neighbors who did not step aside for him the way they once had, and the doors swung shut behind him. Outside, a wagon pulled away fast, wheels grinding hard against frozen ground, and something in Josie's chest that had been clenched tight for 6 weeks, finally, slowly began to loosen. Wes stood very still. For a moment in the thinning crowd, one hand pressed flat against his own chest, as if he could feel his father's hand there instead of his own. 6 weeks of thinking I had to save this ranch through sheer desperate luck, he said. Quiet now, just for Josie. And he'd already made sure it couldn't be lost. Not truly. Not ever. He wanted to see what you'd choose, Josie said gently. Not what you'd be forced into. I chose you, Wes said. Before I knew any of this. Before I knew the land was safe no matter what. I walked into your store because I was desperate. But I stayed married to you, because somewhere in these 6 weeks, desperate turned into something I wasn't looking for and didn't expect to find. Say it plain, Josie said. I've had enough of half-said things this month to last us a lifetime. A small, tired, genuine smile broke across his face. The first real smile she'd seen from him since this whole impossible story began. I love you, Wes said. Not the arrangement, not the bargain. You, Josephine Calder, 6 feet 9 inches of courage I did not deserve to be handed by pure luck in a peach tin counter. 6'9", Josie said, and her voice cracked into something that was half laugh, half tears. You've been married to me 6 weeks, Wes Calder, and you still can't get the number right. Guess I'll just have to keep practicing, he said, and kissed her before she could argue further. The courthouse still half full, the last onlookers pretending very hard not to watch, seemed, for just that one long moment, to hold its breath, along with both of them. A letter came for Wes 11 days after the courthouse. Not from anyone in Ironwood, postmarked from a town 200 miles east. A town Wes hadn't let himself think about in 6 years. He recognized the handwriting on the outside before he'd even broken the seal. Not Adeline's. A man's hand, careful and unfamiliar. And Wes stood at the chitoffel, a long moment stood at the kitchen table, a long moment just looking at his own name written in a stranger's script before he could make himself open it. Josie watched him read it. Watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the careful stillness he wore in a fight. Not the raw grief of the barn or the courtroom. Something quieter. Something that looked almost like a man remembering how to breathe. Wes, he didn't answer right away. Just kept reading, his eyes moving slow down the page. And when he finally looked up, there were tears standing in them that he made no move to hide. It's from Adeline's husband, he said. Man named Thomas Pruitt. Never met him. Never wanted to, if I'm honest. What does he want? Says he heard talk, even out where he lives. About a man up in the territory who stood up in a courthouse and told the truth about his own cowardice. In front of half the county, Wes's voice had gone rough. Says it made him think it was finally time to send something. Adeline asked him to keep, in case a day like that ever came. He set a second, smaller envelope on the table between them, yellowed, soft at the corners from years of handling. Never opened, because there'd never been a seal to break in the first place. Adeline had written it and never sent it at all. He says she wrote it the year before she died. Wes said. Made him promise if he ever heard I'd become a man worth forgiving, he'd see that I got it. Didn't want it delivered any earlier. Said forgiveness handed to a man before he's ready to receive. It isn't really forgiveness. It's just noise. Josie's throat had gone tight. Are you going to open it? Wes looked at the envelope a long moment. At 6 years of silence, sitting inside a fold of paper thinner than a hand's width. Read it with me, he said. I don't think I can do this one alone. She did. The letter was short. 3 sentences. In a hand gone shaky with the fever that would take her only months later. She hadn't been angry, it said. Hadn't spent her marriage resenting him, or wishing him ill, or waiting for an apology that never came. She'd only ever wished. He'd trusted her enough to let her choose him. Broken leg and all, instead of choosing for her. I hope you find someone brave enough to make you open your letters next time," she'd written, at the very end, and there was something almost like humor in it, worn soft with time. "Don't send this one back unread. It's the only one I ever really needed you to have." Wes didn't speak for a long while after that. Josie didn't ask him to. She just sat beside him at the table, her hand over his, and let him grieve a 6-year silence, the same slow, necessary way she'd once grieved a rope and a scream and a friend's hand slipping out of hers. Not alone this time for either of them, not anymore. Jubal came back 3 days after the courthouse, a full week before Thomas Pruitt's letter would ever reach the ranch, hat in his hands, the same posture he'd worn walking away a week and a half before, riding up slow in the gray light of a morning that smelled like the first real snow of the season was coming. Wes met him at the gate. "I don't expect forgiveness today," Jubal said. "I told myself I wouldn't even ask for it. I just came to say, I'm settling my note with the bank myself, whatever it costs me, and I understand if that's not enough." Wes looked at him a long moment. At 30 years of history standing awkward and ashamed in front of him. "Kettering's under investigation," he said. "His bank holdings are frozen along with everything else. Your note's in limbo right now, same as half his other business. I didn't come here for that news. I know you didn't." Wes's jaw worked. "I made a decision, sitting up half of last night. You made a mistake that could have killed 8 horses and burned down something my father built with his own hands. That's not nothing. But you also fought that fire alongside the rest of us, not knowing your own information had helped set it. And you've worked this land longer than I've been alive." He extended his hand, slow, deliberate. "I'm not handing you back everything today. Trust like that takes longer than an apology. But I'm not sending you away either. We rebuild the barn together. However long that takes." Jubal's eyes went bright and wet, and he took Wes's offered hand like it was the last solid thing left in a world that had nearly come apart around him. He picked up a hammer that same afternoon and started on the new frame. Josie's letter to May had gone out the week of the fire, before any of this had resolved, sent not because she expected an answer, but because some debts she'd decided were worth paying even after the show of owing them had nearly kept her silent for good. It was May who arrived in answer, 3 weeks later, riding into Ironwood on a mail coach with a cane in one hand and Josie's own letter in the other, just as the timber frame of the new barn was rising pale and honest against the gray sky. Josie saw her step down from the coach and felt her whole chest seize. May looked older, thinner, walked with a careful, deliberate limp that told its own quiet story about a rope that had broken 4 years and a lifetime ago. But her eyes, when they found Josie's across the frozen street, held nothing Josie had spent 4 years dreading to see. No anger, no blame, just something soft and tired and glad. "You got tall," May said, which wasn't true at all. Josie had been exactly this tall the whole time they'd known each other, but it broke the ice all the same. And Josie laughed, wet and startled, and crossed the street in 3 long strides, and gathered her old friend up into an embrace, careful enough not to jar that careful, deliberate limp. "I'm sorry," Josie said into her shoulder. "I am so sorry, May. I should have stayed. I should have written years ago." "You should have done a lot of things," May said. "So should I have. We were young and scared, and Vandergrift was a snake who never should have had either one of us under his tent." She pulled back, looked at Josie with eyes that had clearly done their own long, private accounting in the 4 years since. "I don't blame you for running, Josie. I blame the rope. I blame the man who wouldn't spend the money for proper rigging. I never once blamed you. And I've spent 4 years wishing I'd found the courage to write and tell you so." "I don't know how to hear that," Josie said. "Honest, raw. I've spent 4 years building an entire life around the shame of what I did." "Then maybe it's time to stop building on it," May said. Gentle, certain. "And start building something new instead." Wes offered her a place at the ranch that same week. Light work, bookkeeping and mending, whatever her leg allowed, and her pride would accept. And May, after 2 days of careful, stubborn negotiating, finally said yes. The new barn rose steady through that snowy December. Jubal's hands and Wes's hands and half the town's hands besides, because word had spread of everything that happened, and, Word, in a town like Ironwood, had a way of turning into casseroles, and borrowed lumber and neighbors showing up at dawn with hammers they hadn't been asked to bring. May kept the accounts from an overturned crate by the door, laughing at Jubal's terrible jokes, her leg propped up on a feed sack, exactly as much a part of the work as anyone swinging a hammer. Josie stood on the porch one such morning, watching it all take shape, and Wes looked up from the frame he was nailing and caught her watching. Smiled, easy and unguarded, in a way she was still getting used to seeing on that once shuttered face. The new barn was finished by Christmas. The town held a dance to celebrate it. Half practical, Jubal argued, since the fresh-swept floor was the largest flat surface for a mile in any direction, and half sentimental, though nobody in Ironwood would have admitted that part out loud. Lanterns hung from the rafters. Fiddle music spilled out into the cold December night, and half the valley turned out in their good coats to eat too much pie and dance too enthusiastically on a barn floor that still smelled faintly of fresh-cut pine. Josie danced with Wes in the middle of that crowded floor, her hand in his, her head, for once in her life, not the highest thing in the room by nearly so wide a margin, because half the ranch hands and their wives stood shoulder to shoulder around them, and nobody so much as glanced twice at the tall woman, turning slow circles beneath the lantern light. Somewhere in the crowd, a little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and asked, in the unguarded way of children, why the tall lady got to dance right in the middle instead of standing at the back. Her mother didn't have a ready answer. Josie, catching the question from across the room, thought that was answer enough. That a question like that could be asked out loud, in a barn full of neighbors, without anyone flinching, without anyone hushing the child for asking. Nobody stared, nobody whispered. They simply danced, same as everyone else, in a barn, built by neighbors who had shown up at dawn without being asked, in a town that had learned. Slowly and imperfectly, and entirely because two people had refused to run from either the truth or each other, exactly what it looked like to see a person clearly and love them anyway. Regrets, Wes murmured, close to her ear, as the fiddle music swelled and the lantern light swayed gold and warm across the rafters. About any of it, Josie considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things now, the store, the counter, the stranger filling up her doorway with a desperate, impossible request. Not one, she said, not a single one. Outside, the snow kept falling soft over Ironwood, over the mended barn and the frozen creek and the ridge where two graves sat quiet under a fresh white blanket. A father who had loved his son fiercely enough to outsmart his own dying fear, and beside him, space enough left for whatever years were still to come. Inside, the fiddle played on, and two people who had each once believed themselves too broken, too strange, too much, or too little for the world to want, turned slow circles together beneath the lantern light, exactly the size they were always meant to be, and exactly where they'd both, after every hard mile it had taken to arrive there, finally chosen to stay.